I walked into the courthouse with my head high and my stomach in knots, cameras flashing so violently it felt like the air itself was breaking apart around me. I already knew what story they wanted. The fallen daughter, the failed CEO, the woman who took family money and burned it all down. I could almost hear the headlines being written as I crossed the marble floor. But what none of them knew, not the reporters, not my parents sitting stiffly in the front row, not even my sister who had filed this case against me, was that I had spent 8 years preparing for this exact kind of humiliation. I just never imagined it would come from my own blood. I had braced myself for the judge's verdict. I had braced myself for public shame. What I was not prepared for was the single question he asked less than 10 minutes later. A question so simple, so precise, that my sister froze mid-breath, my mother went pale, and my father finally stopped pretending this was about love. That question cracked open the truth I had buried for 8 years. And once it was exposed, there was no putting it back. My name is Elena Moore. I am 32 years old. And until very recently, I believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and proved myself long enough, my family would eventually see me as more than a problem they needed to manage. I was wrong. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where history and judgment lived comfortably together. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening to the murmur of the gallery behind me. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I already knew who was there. My parents sat together, shoulders squared, faces carefully neutral. They looked like concerned observers, not like the people who had quietly endorsed the lawsuit meant to destroy me. And beside them sat my younger sister, Lila. Perfect posture, soft expression. Dressed in cream instead of black, like someone attending a difficult meeting rather than a public execution. Lila had always known how to look harmless. 8 years earlier, she was the one my parents worried about. She was the sensitive one, the emotional one, the daughter who needed protecting. I was the other one, the difficult one, the ambitious one, the one who asked uncomfortable questions and refused to accept simple answers. Growing up, I learned quickly that love in my family came with conditions. If you fit the role they designed for you, you were cherished. If you didn't, you were tolerated. I had been tolerated my entire life. I built my company without their help. No loans, no safety net, no family introductions or quiet favors behind closed doors. I worked nights, weekends, holidays. I slept on couches. I missed birthdays. I missed weddings. Every time I chose my work, my parents called it selfish. Every time Lila needed support, they called it family. By the time my company finally stabilized, by the time we signed contracts that made the long years worth it, I thought the hardest part was over. That was when the lawsuit arrived. The filing claimed I had borrowed a massive sum from my family and mismanaged it, that my company was insolvent, that I was hiding losses. That intervention was necessary to protect what little value remained. None of it was true, but truth has a way of struggling when money, appearances, and family reputation are involved. The bailiff called the court to order. Everyone rose. The judge entered, calm and unreadable, and the room settled into a silence that pressed against my ears. Lila's attorney began first. He spoke smoothly, confidently, weaving a story that sounded reasonable if you didn't know me. He talked about concern, about family responsibility, about a younger sister forced into an impossible position by an older sibling who refused to listen. I watched Lila dab at her eyes with perfect timing. I stared straight ahead. When it was my attorney's turn, she stood slowly. She did not rush. She did not dramatize. She simply stated that the claims were false and that we intended to demonstrate that no such loan had ever existed. The judge nodded, flipping through the file. Then he stopped. He looked up, not at me but at Lila. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Ms. Moore," he said, "before we proceed, I need clarification on one point." Lila straightened, her practiced composure still intact. "Yes, Your Honor." "You claim this money was transferred to your sister's company," the judge continued. "Can you tell me the exact date of that transfer?" There was a pause. Just a fraction of a second. But I saw it. Lila hesitated. She gave a date. Confidently. Too confidently. The judge nodded again and looked down at the documents. "And can you tell me," he said, "why the bank records submitted by both parties show no corresponding transfer on or around that date?" The room shifted. Lila opened her mouth, then closed it. Her attorney stepped forward, but the judge raised a hand. "I'm asking her," he said. My mother's fingers tightened around her purse. My father's jaw clenched. Lila swallowed. "There may have been delays," she said, "internal processing issues." The judge leaned back slightly. "Delays do not erase money," he said evenly, "and money of this size leaves footprints." The silence became heavy, uncomfortable. That was when I understood. Not that I would win, but that the story my family had built was starting to collapse under its own weight. As the hearing continued, I drifted inward, my mind pulling me backward through the years that led to this moment. I remembered the first time my parents told me to be patient with Lila. She was younger. She needed time. She needed support. I learned to step aside, again and again. When I launched my company, my father called it a phase. My mother asked how long I planned to embarrass myself before finding something stable. Lila said nothing. She just watched. When my company struggled, they told me it was my own fault. When it succeeded, they told me not to let it go to my head. And when Lila failed at her own ventures, they told me to help her, because that was what family did. I helped, quietly, repeatedly, until the day I realized help had turned into expectation, and expectation had turned into entitlement. The lawsuit was not a sudden betrayal. It was the final move in a pattern that had been forming my entire life. The judge called for a brief recess. The room erupted into whispers. Reporters leaned toward one another. Phones came out. I remained seated. Lila leaned toward our parents, her voice low but urgent. My mother shook her head, panic flickering across her face. My father stared straight ahead, his expression hardening. For the first time, I saw fear in them. Not fear for me. Fear of exposure. When court resumed, my attorney presented the financial records, clear, clean, unambiguous, no loan, no transfer, no debt. The judge listened carefully. Then he looked at Lila again. "Ms. Moore," he said, "this court takes false filings very seriously, especially when they are used to apply pressure under the guise of family concern." Lila's face drained of color. My parents exchanged a look I had never seen before, not concern, calculation. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized this was never about money. It was about control. They could tolerate my independence as long as it did not threaten the hierarchy they lived by. As long as I stayed small enough to be corrected, quiet enough to be guided. The moment I outgrew that role, I became a problem to solve. And problems, in my family, were removed quietly, efficiently, and without remorse. As the judge adjourned for the day, I gathered my things slowly. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at Lila. I walked out past the cameras, past the whispers, past the version of myself they wanted the world to believe. Outside, the air felt sharper, colder, cleaner. For 8 years, I had carried the weight of trying to be enough for people who only loved me when I was useful. That day, standing on the courthouse steps, I finally understood something that should have been obvious long ago. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. I did not need to look at my sister to know how she felt about that first crack in her story. I could sense it the way you sense a shift in weather, subtle but undeniable. Still, as I sat there waiting for the judge to return, my eyes drifted to her without permission. Lila sat perfectly still, hands folded, chin lifted, as if nothing had changed. She even adjusted her sleeve, a small habitual gesture I had seen 1,000 times before. That single movement pulled me backward, not to the courtroom, but to the beginning of everything. I had lived my entire life reacting to that gesture, long before I ever understood what it meant. I had always known my family would choose Lila over me. What I did not know was how early they had taught her that choosing her meant discarding me. When we were children, my parents liked to tell people we were close. Two girls, only a few years apart, raised under the same roof, sharing the same values. It sounded good. It made them look successful. The truth was less tidy. From the outside, Lila looked fragile and sweet, the kind of child adults leaned down to listen to. I was the one who spoke too loudly, asked too many questions, and refused to smile on cue. They said I was strong. What they meant was that I did not need protecting, and in my family, needing protection was currency. The first time I realized I came second, we were still young enough that the memory should have faded. It did not. Lila had broken something valuable, a small antique my mother loved. When our parents asked what happened, Lila cried. Real tears, trembling lips, shoulders shaking. I remember standing there, waiting for the truth to matter. Instead, my mother turned to me and asked why I had upset my sister. My father said I should have known better than to let her touch it. I was told to apologize. Lila never said a word. That was the day she learned that silence could be louder than honesty. As we grew older, the pattern hardened. If Lila struggled, it was because she was sensitive. If I struggled, it was because I was difficult. If she failed, she was supported. If I failed, it was dissected. Every family dinner felt like a quiet performance. Lila played the role of the daughter who needed care. I played the role of the daughter who should know better. They used phrases that sounded reasonable to outsiders. Be patient with your sister. She feels things more deeply. You're stronger than she is. You don't need as much. Each sentence pushed me further out of the circle while pretending it was an act of love. By the time we were teenagers, Lila had learned exactly how to position herself. She knew when to cry and when to stay quiet. She knew which looks earned sympathy and which earned protection. I, on the other hand, learned to swallow my reactions. Any display of anger or frustration only confirmed what they already believed about me. I was volatile, I was emotional, I was the problem. There was a night I still think about, one my parents probably forgot the moment it ended. Lila had missed curfew. I covered for her. I always did. When my parents found out anyway, they demanded to know why she was late. She said she had been scared to come home because I had yelled at her earlier. It was a lie, a small one. But it worked. I remember my father looking at me with disappointment instead of concern. My mother told me I needed to control my temper. I was grounded. Lila was hugged. That was when I understood that truth did not protect me. Compliance did. When adulthood arrived, the labels changed, but the roles did not. Lila became the daughter my parents worried about navigating the world. I became the daughter they expected to compromise. Every decision I made that did not align with their vision was treated like a personal offense. When I chose my career path, they called it unstable. When I refused help that came with strings attached, they called it pride. When I succeeded, they downplayed it. When Lila struggled, they called family meetings. They spoke about me differently when they thought I could not hear. She's smart but hard to deal with. She's always been like that. Lila is just easier. Easier. That word followed me everywhere. It excused everything they did. The most painful part was that none of it felt malicious in the moment. It felt practical. It felt justified. They framed every choice as necessary. Necessary to keep peace. Necessary to protect the family. Necessary to avoid embarrassment. And slowly, without ever saying it out loud, they trained me to accept less. By the time I moved away, I had already learned not to expect fairness. I did not leave after a dramatic fight. There was no shouting, no slammed doors. I left the way people leave places that have already pushed them out. Quietly. I told myself distance would fix it. That if I removed myself from the daily friction, the love underneath would surface. For a while, I believed it had worked. Calls became polite, visits became rare but civil. Lila asked surface-level questions about my life. My parents stopped criticizing my choices directly. I thought we had reached an understanding. What I did not realize was that distance did not dissolve the hierarchy. It only froze it. While I was building my life piece by piece, they were building a narrative about me. A narrative where I was reckless, where I was ambitious to a fault, where my independence was a warning sign. Lila remained the reference point. The good daughter, the one who stayed close, the one who did not make them uncomfortable. The first time I sensed something had shifted was subtle. Lila asked questions she had never asked before. How was my company structured? Who handled finances? Whether I had investors? She framed it as curiosity, as concern. I answered vaguely. Old habits die hard. I had learned that sharing too much only invited judgment. Looking back, I can see how carefully she moved, how she collected impressions instead of facts, how she mirrored concern while storing ammunition. Sitting in that courtroom years later, watching her adjust her sleeve, I understood that nothing she was doing was new. She had been practicing this role since childhood. The only difference now was the scale. Instead of family dinners and whispered judgments, the stage was public. Instead of parental approval, the prize was control. My parents liked to tell themselves they loved us equally. I am sure they still believe that. But love, in our family, was never evenly distributed. It flowed toward whoever made their lives easier, whoever reflected them best, whoever did not challenge the story they wanted to tell about themselves. I had challenged it simply by existing as myself. As the judge called the room back to order, I felt something strange settle in my chest. It was not fear. It was clarity. The realization that the lawsuit had not created this divide. It had only revealed it. For years, I had told myself that my family did not mean to hurt me, that they were flawed but well-intentioned, that if I just explained myself better, tried harder, softened my edges, they would meet me halfway. They never had. They had chosen Lila not because she was right, but because she fit. The courtroom lights seemed harsher as the proceedings resumed. I kept my gaze forward, my posture steady. I no longer needed my parents to understand me. I no longer needed my sister to see me as anything other than an obstacle she had decided to remove. What I needed now was something I had never allowed myself before. Distance without guilt, truth without apology, and the strength to stop hoping for a version of family that had never existed. As the judge spoke again, his voice calm and precise, I realized that this case was not just about money or lies. It was about a pattern that had followed me my entire life, a pattern that had finally met resistance. And for the first time, I was not going to step aside and let someone else take my place. Not again. I left my parents' house without an argument, without slammed doors or final speeches, just a quiet understanding that staying any longer would cost me something I could never get back. I remember standing in the driveway with my suitcase, the late afternoon sun stretching my shadow across the concrete, and realizing no one was coming out to stop me. That was the moment it became clear. I was not being pushed out. I was being allowed to leave because my absence made things easier. I drove away with the radio off, listening only to the sound of my own breathing and the steady hum of the engine. I told myself I was choosing independence, not exile. That framing mattered back then. It helped me swallow the truth that my family had already made peace with a version of me that did not include staying. Starting over in a new city felt like stepping into thin air. I had no safety net, no familiar faces, no quiet assurances that if things went wrong, someone would catch me. What I had instead was anonymity. No one knew who my parents were. No one cared that I was the older sister or the difficult one. I was just another woman trying to earn her place in a crowded room. The first months were brutal. I took work that barely paid the bills and smiled through meetings where my ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them louder. I learned quickly that confidence without credentials was treated like arrogance. I learned even faster that exhaustion was not an excuse. There was no one to soften the edges for me anymore. And yet, for the first time, the rules were honest. If I failed, it was on me. If I succeeded, it belonged to me. There was something grounding in that clarity. I stopped measuring myself against my sister. I stopped waiting for approval that had never come. I focused on the work in front of me, one task at a time, one late night after another. I slept on a friend's couch longer than I like to admit. I ate cheap takeout and counted every dollar. I built skills quietly, without announcing my progress to anyone who might use it against me. When I made mistakes, I fixed them without asking permission. When opportunities came, I took them even if they scared me. There were nights I questioned everything, nights when the loneliness felt heavier than any rejection I had known growing up. But even on those nights, I felt something unfamiliar underneath the doubt. Relief. I was no longer performing for anyone. I was no longer the problem that needed managing. The idea for my company did not arrive fully formed. It grew out of frustration, out of watching systems fail people who deserved better. I saw inefficiencies others accepted as normal. I asked questions that made rooms uncomfortable. Old habits die hard. The difference was that this time, discomfort led to solutions instead of silence. I registered the business under a name that had nothing to do with my family. That decision was deliberate. I did not want their shadow anywhere near it. No quiet pride, no subtle claims, no assumptions that whatever I built belonged to them by default. When I signed the paperwork, my hands shook. Not from fear of failure, but from the weight of responsibility. There was no one to blame if this collapsed. That thought terrified me. It also made me feel alive. The early days were slow. Progress came in inches, not leaps. I pitched to people who barely listened. I lost contracts I thought were guaranteed. I learned how to hear no without taking it as a verdict on my worth. Each rejection sharpened me. Each small win reminded me why I started. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell my sister. I let them believe I was still drifting, still experimenting, still one mistake away from asking for help. That assumption protected me more than any legal document could have. Every so often a relative would ask how things were going. I kept my answers vague. I had learned that clarity invited commentary. Silence gave me room to breathe. When the company finally landed its first real client, I celebrated alone. I sat on the floor of my apartment with a cheap bottle of wine and let myself feel proud without bracing for criticism. No one told me to be careful. No one warned me not to get ahead of myself. It was just me and the quiet acknowledgement that I had done something real. As the months turned into years, the business stabilized. We hired slowly, carefully. I chose people who valued transparency, who asked questions instead of deflecting them. I built a culture that rewarded accountability instead of performance theater. It mattered to me that no one felt the way I had grown up feeling: replaceable, invisible, conditional. Success crept in quietly. There were no headlines, no sudden leaps, just steady growth and increasing confidence from partners who trusted us with their work. I turned down opportunities that felt wrong. I learned when to walk away. I learned that walking away was not the same as losing. And through it all, I kept my distance. My parents called less often. When they did, the conversations stayed shallow. They asked about my job in the same way people ask about the weather, politely and without real interest. My sister reached out occasionally, her questions always wrapped in concern. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you managing okay? I answered just enough to seem normal. There was a part of me that hoped this distance meant peace, that we had found a rhythm where no one needed to compete or sacrifice. I convinced myself that my success, kept small and quiet, would not threaten the balance they preferred. I was wrong again. The first sign came during a holiday visit I almost skipped. I noticed the way my parents listened when my sister spoke about her struggles, leaning in with sympathy. When I mentioned work, the room shifted. My mother asked if I was sure it was sustainable. My father asked what my backup plan was. Their concern felt familiar, like a well-worn coat I had outgrown but still recognized. Later that evening, my sister pulled me aside. She asked questions that felt rehearsed. How big was the company now? Who handled the money? Whether I ever felt overwhelmed managing it alone. Her tone was gentle, her eyes were sharp. I answered carefully. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself family curiosity was harmless. But something had changed. On the drive back to my apartment, the unease followed me. I realized then that my success had crossed an invisible line. As long as I struggled, I was dismissed. As long as I stayed small, I was tolerated. The moment I became stable without them, I became unpredictable. Unpredictability scared them. I did not know yet how far they would go to restore control. I did not know my sister had already begun reframing my independence as recklessness. I did not know my parents were listening more closely to her version of events than to reality. What I did know was that the quiet life I had built was about to be disturbed. The contract I was preparing to sign that week should have been routine. We had negotiated for months. The terms were fair. The trust was there. I walked into the office that morning feeling cautiously optimistic, unaware that a different kind of meeting was already being scheduled somewhere else. As I sat at my desk, reviewing the final details, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. Old instincts told me not every interruption deserved attention. I would learn soon enough how wrong that instinct was. At that moment, I still believed that distance could protect me, that living well and staying quiet was enough. I had built my life where my family could not reach me, brick by brick, boundary by boundary. I did not yet understand that the very act of building it had given them a reason to try. The first sign that something was wrong did not come as a threat or an accusation. It came as hesitation. I was sitting in my office reviewing the final version of a contract we had been negotiating for months when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I ignored it. 5 minutes later, an email arrived from our bank, brief and oddly cautious, asking to schedule a call regarding a matter requiring clarification. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was routine. Growing companies attract scrutiny. That was normal. The call happened an hour later. The banker's voice was polite, professional, and carefully neutral. He explained that a legal filing had appeared under my name, one that required them to place a temporary hold on certain transactions until the situation was reviewed. I asked him what filing he was referring to. There was a pause before he answered. A bankruptcy petition. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I told him there had to be a mistake. My company was solvent. Our books were clean. We had never missed a payment. He listened patiently and then said something that made the room feel smaller. The petitioner is listed as your sister. I ended the call without fully remembering how. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to understand how those words fit together. Bankruptcy, petition, sister. None of it aligned with the life I was living or the facts I knew. My hands began to shake as I pulled up the court filing on my laptop. It was all there. My name, my company. Pages of accusations written in formal language that transformed lies into something that looked disturbingly official. According to the document, I had borrowed a significant sum of money from my family, failed to manage it responsibly, and driven the business to the edge of collapse. The petition claimed intervention was necessary to prevent further losses. I read it twice, then a third time. I had never borrowed money from my parents or from Lila, not once. I had gone out of my way to avoid that exact scenario, knowing how easily generosity in my family turned into leverage. As I was still trying to process what I was seeing, my phone began to buzz again. This time, it was not the bank. It was a reporter. She asked if I would like to comment on the filing. She used phrases like family dispute and financial mismanagement. I told her she had the wrong information. She apologized politely and told me the story was already circulating. The article went live less than an hour later. By the end of the day, my inbox was flooded. Clients asking for reassurance, partners requesting meetings, employees quietly checking in, their messages careful and restrained. The story had been framed before I had even understood what was happening. I was no longer a CEO managing a growing company. I was a liability. I called my parents that evening. I did not scream. I did not accuse. I asked one simple question. Did you know about this? There was a silence on the line that told me everything before my mother spoke. She said they were aware of the filing. She said Lila had been under a lot of stress. She said it was a difficult decision, but one made with the family's best interests in mind. I asked why no one had come to me first. My father answered that sometimes intervention was necessary when someone refused to see reality. Reality, that word again, always used when they wanted to define my life for me. I told them the claims were false. I told them there was no loan, no debt, no hidden losses. My mother sighed and said this was not the time to argue details. My father said cooperating would make things easier for everyone. When I asked whose side they were on, my mother said they were not choosing sides. They were choosing peace. The call ended with my father telling me to stay calm and trust the process. Trust had never felt so dangerous. Lila called later that night. Her voice was soft, almost tired. She said she never wanted things to get this far. She said the lawyers had advised her that formal action was the only way to protect the family. She told me she was still on my side, even if it did not look like it. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one question. Why didn't you come to me first? She said she had tried. She said I was always so busy. She said she did not feel safe confronting me directly. Safe. From what exactly, she did not say. By the end of the week, the damage was no longer theoretical. One of our largest partners postponed an expansion we had planned for months. Another requested additional guarantees before proceeding. The bank extended its review. Nothing had been decided, but everything was on hold. Uncertainty spread faster than any confirmed loss ever could. Inside the office, the atmosphere changed. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Meetings became formal and cautious. I could see the questions in people's eyes. Was I still in control? Was the company at risk? Was I telling them everything? I held it together in public. I answered questions calmly. I assured people we were addressing the situation. I did not tell them that the ground beneath me felt unstable in a way it never had before. At night, alone in my apartment, the weight of it all pressed in. Not just the legal threat, but the realization that my family had chosen this path deliberately. This was not a misunderstanding or an emotional reaction. It was calculated. They had taken the one thing they knew would hurt me most and turned it into a weapon. The worst part was how familiar it felt. The framing, the concern, the insistence that this was for my own good. They had always done this. The scale was new. The tactic was not. I read the petition again, slower this time. That was when I noticed something small but unsettling. The language around the alleged loan was specific, almost technical, as if it had been written by someone with intimate knowledge of my business operations. The dates referenced internal milestones that were not public. The assumptions about cash flow reflected conversations that had never left my office. That realization sent a chill through me. If those details were accurate, someone had helped her. I did not know who yet. I did not know how deep it went. But for the first time since the filing, the shock gave way to something sharper. Awareness. This was not just about family, it was about access. The following Monday, a senior member of my team asked for a private meeting. He said some employees were worried. He said transparency would help calm fears. I agreed, even as a knot formed in my chest. I told him the truth as plainly as I could. The claims were false. We were not bankrupt. We were fighting it. He nodded, but his eyes flickered. Later that day, another employee asked if contingency plans were being discussed. Someone else asked about severance policies. Fear was seeping in through the cracks. That night I sat at my desk long after everyone else had left, staring at the city lights through the window. I thought about all the years I had tried to stay out of my family's way, all the compromises I had made to avoid conflict. And still, here I was, being dragged into a public battle I had never agreed to fight. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the thought I had been avoiding. They were not trying to help me. They were trying to take something from me. The next morning, my lawyer called with an update. The court had scheduled an initial hearing. The timeline was moving faster than expected. I thanked her and hung up, my mind already racing ahead. If my family believed this filing would scare me into compliance, they had miscalculated. Fear had its place. It could paralyze, it could destroy, but it could also clarify. As I closed my laptop and prepared to face another day of careful explanations and unanswered questions, one thing became painfully clear. This was not a disagreement that could be smoothed over with time and silence. This was a line they had crossed, and once crossed, it could not be uncrossed. The silence from my family after the lawsuit became public was louder than any accusation they could have thrown at me. Days passed without a call, without a message, without even the pretense of concern. It was as if I had been erased overnight. Not because I had done something wrong, but because acknowledging me would have required them to face what they had helped set in motion. I checked my phone more times than I wanted to admit, not because I expected comfort, but because some part of me still hoped for resistance, for a voice that would say this had gone too far. Nothing came. The invitation arrived 3 days later. My mother's voice was careful, overly calm, when she asked me to come by the house so we could talk like a family. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed. I agreed without hesitation. If they were finally willing to speak, I wanted to hear what justification they had chosen. Their living room looked exactly the same as it always had. Neutral colors, carefully arranged furniture, family photos that told a curated version of our story. I noticed, not for the first time, that most of the framed memories featured Lila. Graduations, vacations, smiling moments frozen in time. I wondered how many people had sat in this room believing we were close. My parents were already seated when I arrived. Lila sat between them, her posture slightly hunched, hands folded in her lap like a child waiting to be forgiven. No one offered me a hug. No one asked how I was holding up. My father gestured for me to sit, his expression serious, as if we were about to negotiate terms rather than talk about the destruction of my life. He started by saying they were disappointed, not in the situation, but in how it had escalated. My mother nodded, adding that things never should have reached a courtroom. I waited, listening, letting them speak. Every word felt like a familiar pattern, one I had grown up navigating. They spoke about stress, about misunderstandings, about intentions. No one said the word betrayal. When I asked why they had supported the filing without speaking to me first, my father said they trusted Lila's judgment. My mother said Lila had been under immense pressure and needed support. They both emphasized that they were not taking sides. They were just trying to protect the family. Protect it from what, I wanted to ask? From the truth, from discomfort, from the reality that one daughter had chosen to destroy the other. Lila finally spoke. Her voice trembled just enough to sound sincere. She said she never wanted to hurt me. She said she felt responsible for stepping in when she believed I was making dangerous decisions. She said the lawsuit was never meant to shame me, only to create accountability. I looked at her and realized something unsettling. She believed what she was saying. Or at least she believed in the version of reality where her actions were justified. She had learned early that intention mattered more than impact, especially when she was the one defining it. When I told them again that there was no loan, no hidden debt, my father sighed and said this was not the time to debate facts. My mother reminded me of everything they had given me growing up, the sacrifices they had made, the opportunities I had been afforded. Her voice softened as she said, "After all we've done, the least you can do is not drag this family through more embarrassment." That was when it hit me. This was never about money. It was about reputation, about preserving an image at any cost. I was not their daughter in that moment. I was a liability. They asked me to consider settling, to step back from the company temporarily, to let Lila help manage things until the situation calmed down. They framed it as generosity, as concern, as a way to protect me from further damage. I asked them what would happen if I refused. The room went quiet. My father said they hoped it would not come to that. My mother said they did not want to choose between their daughters. Lila looked down at her hands and said she just wanted peace. Peace, I realized, was code for compliance. I left that meeting with the hollow understanding that the family I had tried so hard to preserve no longer existed, if it ever had. They were not asking me to compromise. They were asking me to disappear quietly so things could go back to how they preferred them. The consequences followed me back to work. Within days, rumors that my family supported the lawsuit began to circulate. It was subtle at first. A question asked twice. A meeting rescheduled without explanation. Then it became explicit. A board advisor asked me privately whether I had considered stepping aside for the good of the company. A partner mentioned that stability mattered more than loyalty in uncertain times. When your own family turns away, people notice. It becomes permission. I tried to reassure my team, but I could see the doubt growing. They did not know my parents. They did not know my history. They only saw a lawsuit backed by blood, by the implication that the people who knew me best believed I was a risk. At night, the isolation pressed in. I replayed conversations from my childhood, seeing them with new clarity. Every time I had been told to be the bigger person, every time I had been asked to step aside for Lila's sake, every time my silence had been praised as maturity, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I had believed that loyalty would eventually be returned. It never was. One evening I stood in my apartment staring at the city lights, wondering how many decisions I had made to avoid exactly this moment. How many times I had chosen peace over honesty. How many warnings I had ignored because facing them would have meant admitting something painful, that my family's love was conditional, and I had outgrown the conditions. The breaking point came when I saw a photo online. My parents and Lila attending a social event together, smiling, arm in arm. The caption mentioned how difficult the situation had been for them. Not for me, for them. The comments were full of sympathy, prayers, support. I realized then that they had already rewritten the story. In their version, they were the victims of a difficult daughter. Lila was the brave sister trying to do the right thing. I was the chaos they had to contain. That night, I stopped trying to explain myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I went back through the lawsuit documents with fresh eyes, not as someone hoping to clear her name, but as someone preparing to defend her life. I noticed patterns I had overlooked before, assumptions that could only have come from inside knowledge, timelines that aligned too neatly with internal discussions. Someone had helped her, and my family had made sure she felt entitled to do it. For the first time since this began, something inside me hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I had been pushed to the edge of everything I had built, not by strangers, but by the people who claimed to love me most. They thought they were teaching me a lesson. They thought pressure would force me to surrender. What they did not understand was that they had finally taken away the last thing holding me back. The illusion that I owed them my silence. As I closed the folder and turned off the lights, one thought settled clearly in my mind. If my family could call this love, then love was no longer something I needed from them. What I needed now was survival, and for the first time I was ready to choose it. The first account freeze happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary day that makes disasters feel unreal. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. At first I thought it was another routine security alert. Then I read the words carefully. Account access temporarily restricted pending legal review. I stared at the screen, my fingers numb. I refreshed the app. Same message. I logged out and logged back in, still locked. Within minutes, my CFO was on the line, her voice tight. She had just received the same notification for the corporate operating account. Payroll was scheduled for Friday. Vendor payments were queued. Everything was frozen in place, like a body mid-fall. We spent the next 2 hours on calls with the bank's legal department, listening to carefully worded explanations that all traced back to the same source. The pending bankruptcy claim, the alleged debt, the risk assessment protocols triggered by litigation involving family creditors. Family creditors. The phrase burned. By noon, the damage was already spreading. A vendor called asking why a payment had bounced. A partner emailed asking whether rumors of insolvency were true. Someone forwarded me an article from a business blog speculating about leadership instability at my company. I hadn't lost the company yet, but I could feel it slipping, like sand running through fingers no matter how tightly you clench. That afternoon, I called my parents. Not to argue, not to plead. I wanted them to understand the consequences of what they had done. My father answered. His tone was calm, almost relieved, as if he had been expecting the call. I explained what had happened, how the accounts were frozen, how employees would panic if payroll was delayed. I told him this wasn't abstract anymore. People's lives were about to be affected. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "These things happen in business. Sometimes pressure is necessary to bring clarity." Clarity. I asked him if he was willing to see my company collapse just to prove a point. He said he didn't see it that way. He said if I had nothing to hide, everything would resolve itself. When I reminded him that he and my mother were publicly supporting Lila's claims, he grew defensive. He said they were trying to stay neutral. He said Lila was under stress and needed reassurance. He said I should stop framing this as an attack. "It feels like one," I said quietly. There was a pause. Then he said, "Elena, you've always taken things too personally." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't cruelty born of anger. It was something worse. Indifference wrapped in moral superiority. They could watch me burn as long as they believed they were standing on higher ground. The betrayal didn't stop there. The next morning, one of my senior managers requested an emergency meeting. He had been with me for 3 years. I trusted him. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as he spoke. He said he had been approached by someone claiming to represent my sister's legal team. They asked questions about internal cash flow, about upcoming contracts, about contingency plans. They framed it as due diligence. He told them nothing, he assured me. But the fact that they felt comfortable reaching out at all told me everything I needed to know. The walls were closing in from the inside. By midweek, the rumors turned uglier. An anonymous source leaked a story suggesting I had misled investors about my financial position. The phrasing mirrored language from the lawsuit almost exactly. Someone was feeding the narrative carefully and strategically. I recognized the pattern. This wasn't panic. It was a campaign. At night, the weight of it pressed down on me until sleep felt impossible. I lay awake replaying conversations with Lila, searching for the moment she had crossed from resentment into something more calculated. I wondered how long she had been planning this, how long my parents had known, whether any of it had ever been spontaneous. The house I lived in suddenly felt fragile. The mortgage payment loomed. If the account stayed frozen, I wouldn't just lose the company. I could lose my home, my credit, my entire sense of stability. And still, my family said nothing. On Thursday, I received an email from my mother. Not about the lawsuit, not about the damage. It was about Thanksgiving plans. She asked if I would still be coming, considering everything. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The audacity of pretending normalcy while my life was being dismantled felt surreal. I didn't respond. That same day, my legal team discovered something disturbing. One of the documents submitted in support of the bankruptcy claim referenced internal projections that had never been shared outside my executive circle, numbers that existed only in private planning sessions. Someone had talked. The realization hit me like ice water. This wasn't just my family attacking from the outside. There was a leak inside my company. Someone I paid. Someone I trusted. Someone who sat across from me in meetings and nodded along while feeding information to my sister's lawyers. I felt sick. I wanted to confront everyone, to demand answers, to burn the whole structure down and rebuild from scratch. But instinct told me to wait, to observe, to let the truth surface on its own. Pressure has a way of revealing fractures. On Friday morning, the betrayal became undeniable. One of my key engineers resigned without warning. No exit conversation. No explanation beyond a vague mention of personal reasons. Within hours, I learned through a third party that he had accepted a position at a firm connected to Lila's network. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. I felt the floor drop out from under me. Every loss compounded the last. Trust eroded, stability cracked. And through it all, my parents maintained their public silence, their quiet alignment with the story that I was unraveling on my own. I confronted Lila that evening. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I asked her one question. Was this your plan from the beginning? She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Enough. She said she had no idea what I was talking about. She said the media twisted things. She said if people were leaving my company, maybe it was because they sensed instability. You mean the instability you created, I said. She sighed, as if tired of explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. Elena, you built something fragile. You tied everything to yourself. When that happens, it only takes one push. I realized then that she wasn't pretending to be innocent. She was proud. She believed she was exposing a weakness. She believed I deserved this for refusing to stay in my place. That night, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the things I had earned through years of sacrifice. And for the first time, I truly understood what it meant to be alone. Not lonely, alone. There is a difference. Loneliness is the absence of people. Being alone is the absence of illusion. I had spent my life believing that no matter how independent I became, my family would be there as a foundation. Now I saw the truth. They were not my foundation. They were the weight tied to my ankles. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It sharpened. It focused. If this was war, then I needed to stop reacting and start thinking. I stopped making emotional calls. I stopped checking social media. I stopped explaining myself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. Instead, I began documenting everything, every suspicious interaction, every timeline inconsistency, every piece of information that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. I reviewed the lawsuit line by line, not as a victim, but as a strategist. Patterns emerged, assumptions that could only come from internal knowledge, claims that relied on information no outsider should have had. They had underestimated me. They thought grief would make me reckless, that fear would make me fold, that family pressure would force me to surrender. They didn't understand the one thing growing clearer with every betrayal. I had already lost the family they were threatening to take away. There was nothing left for them to leverage. As the week ended and the city lights flickered on outside my window, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there. The damage was real, but beneath it something steadier was forming. Resolve. They had pushed me to the edge of everything I loved, believing I would beg them to pull me back. Instead, I was learning how to stand without them, and I wasn't done yet. The idea that saved me did not arrive like inspiration. It arrived like exhaustion, quiet, heavy, and unavoidable. I was sitting alone in my office long after everyone had gone home, the city outside reduced to scattered lights and distant sirens, when I finally stopped trying to fight the chaos head-on. Fighting was what they expected. Panic, denials, emotional reactions they could twist into proof that I was unstable. That was when I realized something simple and terrifying. Lila did not need to win in court to destroy me. She only needed the process to drag on long enough to bleed me dry. Every frozen account, every delayed contract, every whispered rumor was doing her work for her. This wasn't a lawsuit, it was a slow suffocation. So I stopped thinking like a defendant and started thinking like a CEO again. The first step was silence, not weakness, control. I instructed my legal team to stop responding reactively and instead document everything with obsessive precision. Dates, times, who said what, who benefited. I stopped answering calls from my parents entirely. Every voicemail from my mother went unheard. Every carefully worded message from my father remained unopened. They were no longer part of the equation. The second step was observation. I gathered my senior leadership team for what I framed as a routine operational review. I watched them carefully as they spoke, not their words but their posture, who avoided eye contact, who asked questions that felt rehearsed, who seemed more interested in what I didn't say than what I did. One name kept surfacing in my mind, not because of something obvious, but because of something subtle. A project manager named Aaron. Reliable, friendly. The kind of person no one ever suspected because he made himself useful without being visible. He had access to financial projections. He attended meetings where timelines were discussed. He also happened to have worked briefly with a firm tied to Lila's social circle years earlier. I didn't confront him. I didn't change his access. Instead, I did something riskier. I fed him a lie, not a dramatic one, just a quiet adjustment. I mentioned casually during a meeting that we were exploring a contingency plan involving an offshore account restructure if the account freezes continued. I used specific phrasing, specific numbers, details that would sound credible to someone looking for ammunition. Then I waited. 3 days later, Lila's legal team filed an amended motion referencing concerns about asset relocation strategies involving offshore structures. The language mirrored my words almost exactly. I stared at the filing, my hands steady, my heartbeat calm. There it was. Proof, not circumstantial, not emotional, direct. The betrayal had a name. I felt no rage, no urge to scream, just clarity, the kind that sharpens your vision and drains the noise from your thoughts. They had underestimated me not because they thought I was weak, but because they thought I was predictable. That afternoon, I met with my lead attorney and slid the documents across the table. I showed her the internal meeting notes, the timeline, the amended filing, the overlap. She looked up slowly. "This changes everything," she said. I nodded. "I know." What she explained next felt surreal. With evidence of internal sabotage and coordination between a family plaintiff and an employee, the narrative shifted. This was no longer a simple bankruptcy dispute. It was potential fraud, abuse of process, conspiracy. For the first time since this nightmare began, the law was no longer a weapon aimed at me. It was something I could wield. We prepared quietly. Subpoenas, requests, strategic disclosures. Nothing flashy, nothing public. I wanted Lila comfortable, confident. I wanted her thinking she was winning. And she was. At least that's what my parents believed. My mother called again that week. This time her voice cracked. She said she was worried about my health. She said the stress wasn't good for me. She said maybe I should let Lila handle things temporarily so I could rest. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked her a question I had never dared to ask before. If this were happening to Lila, I said, would you be asking her to step aside? The silence stretched long enough to become an answer. My father took the phone. He spoke about sacrifice, about family unity, about how sometimes one person has to bear discomfort for the greater good. I told him calmly that I had already borne enough. Then I hung up. The next move came from Lila sooner than I expected. She requested a private meeting. She framed it as reconciliation. She said she didn't want things to get uglier. She said the media attention was hurting everyone. She suggested we sit down, just the two of us, and talk honestly. I agreed. We met at a quiet restaurant she knew I liked. Neutral ground, soft lighting, the kind of place where difficult conversations are softened by ambiance. She arrived smiling, dressed simply, playing the role of the concerned sister perfectly. She asked how I was holding up. She said she hated seeing me so stressed. I let her talk. Then she said it. The real reason she was there. She suggested a settlement, not just financial, structural. She proposed that I step down as CEO and retain an advisory role while she helped stabilize the company through a transition period. I looked at her and saw it clearly. This wasn't about saving me. It was about owning what I built. "You're asking me to give you my company," I said. She tilted her head sympathetically. "I'm asking you to let go before it breaks you." I leaned back in my chair. "You know what's interesting?" I said quietly. "You've never once asked if I actually did what you accused me of." She smiled. "That's not the point." There it was. The truth slipped out without effort. I left the meeting without agreeing to anything, She didn't look worried. She thought she still had control. That night, I finalized the last piece of my counter-strategy. We filed a motion requesting the judge review evidence of coordinated interference, internal data leaks, and misrepresentation of financial intent. It was concise, precise, devastating. And then we waited. The hearing was scheduled sooner than expected. When I walked into the courthouse that morning, cameras were already waiting. Reporters murmured. Headlines had been drafted before I arrived. They were ready to watch me fall. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded, my face calm. Across the aisle, Lila sat with our parents. She wore the expression of someone who believed the ending was already written. The judge entered. Proceedings began. Lila's attorney spoke confidently, repeating the familiar narrative. Irresponsibility, hidden debts, failure. Then it was my attorney's turn. She didn't start with emotion. She didn't defend my character. She asked one question. "Your Honor," she said, "before we proceed, we request clarification on whether this court has been made aware of evidence suggesting that this bankruptcy filing was supported by improperly obtained internal corporate information." The room shifted. The judge looked up. Lila stiffened. My parents leaned forward. That single question cracked something open. As the documents were submitted, as timelines were laid out, as the connections became impossible to ignore, I watched Lila's composure falter for the first time. Not panic, shock. She hadn't expected resistance this sharp, this organized. The judge's gaze moved from the papers to Lila, then to her attorney. "Ms. Moore," he said slowly, "were you in possession of internal financial projections that were not part of any public disclosure at the time this motion was filed?" Lila froze, not metaphorically, physically. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her attorney intervened, but the damage was done. The judge leaned back, studying her. "That is a very specific question," he said, "and it requires a very specific answer." In that moment, everything shifted. The courtroom no longer felt like a place where I was on trial. It felt like a place where the truth was finally being forced into the light. And as I sat there, watching the confidence drain from my sister's face, I knew something she didn't yet understand. She hadn't just underestimated me. She had exposed herself. And this was only the beginning. The air in the courtroom felt heavier after that question, as if someone had quietly sealed the exits and turned up the pressure. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the polished wood of the table, listening to the subtle sounds around me. Papers shifting, a chair creaking. The soft, nervous inhale of someone who hadn't expected the ground to move beneath them. Lila finally answered. Her voice was controlled, but there was a thin edge to it now. She said she had relied on information provided by her legal counsel. She said she had no direct access to my company's internal documents. She said she had acted in good faith, trusting professionals. Good faith. The phrase echoed in my head like a bad joke. The judge didn't respond immediately. He flipped through the stack of exhibits my attorney had submitted, page by page, taking his time. I could see my parents out of the corner of my eye. My mother's hands were clenched in her lap. My father sat rigidly upright, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed straight ahead as if refusing to acknowledge what was unfolding. My attorney stood again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply walked the court through the sequence of events with clinical precision. She showed how the amended filing referenced contingency plans that had never been disclosed externally. She demonstrated how the language used mirrored internal terminology unique to my leadership team. She introduced time-stamped meeting notes, cross-referenced with communication records obtained through discovery. With every point, the room grew quieter. "This information," my attorney said calmly, "could only have come from one of two sources. Either Ms. Moore had unauthorized access to proprietary data, or someone inside the company provided it to her or her representatives." The judge looked directly at Lila. "Which is it?" he asked. Lila glanced at her lawyer. Just a flicker. Enough. Her lawyer objected, citing speculation, but the judge waved him off. "I'm not interested in theatrics," he said. "I'm interested in understanding whether this court is being used to legitimize an internal sabotage effort." The word sabotage hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. My mother let out a small sound, almost a whimper. My father leaned toward Lila's attorney and whispered something urgently. I wondered briefly whether this was the first time they realized how far this had gone. The judge ordered a brief recess. As everyone stood, the tension didn't release. It thickened. I remained seated for a moment, grounding myself, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing. This was the moment where panic usually set in for people like my sister. The moment when control slips and desperation rushes in to fill the gap. When we reconvened, the judge's tone had shifted. It was no longer exploratory, it was firm. He announced that the court would expand the scope of review to include potential abuse of process and misrepresentation. He ordered immediate preservation of communications between Lila, her legal team, and any third parties with access to my company's internal systems. My attorney's posture didn't change, but I saw the faintest nod. This was the opening we needed. Lila, on the other hand, looked shaken. She tried to maintain her composure, but the mask was cracking. Her confidence had been built on the assumption that family loyalty would shield her, that no one would force the situation into a space where evidence mattered more than narrative. She had been wrong. As the hearing adjourned for the day, reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted. I kept my head down, walking steadily beside my attorney, letting her shield me from the noise. Behind us, I heard my mother call my name. I stopped. I turned slowly, meeting her eyes. She looked older than I remembered, smaller. For the first time, she didn't look authoritative or disappointed. She looked afraid. "Elena," she said softly, "this has gone too far." I studied her face, searching for something familiar. Concern, regret, accountability. I found none of it. "This went too far the moment you let her file that claim," I said quietly. My father stepped forward. "We didn't know it would turn into this," he said. "We thought it would be handled privately." Privately, silently, with me absorbing the damage while they preserved their comfort. "You knew it would hurt me," I said. "You just didn't think it would hurt you." He flinched. Lila stood behind them, her expression carefully neutral. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The shift in power was already undeniable. That night, the consequences began to ripple outward. A key partner called to reassure me that they were standing by. Another admitted they had paused engagement until the situation clarified, but said the hearing had changed their perception. The narrative was fracturing. Internally, my legal team moved fast. Subpoenas were prepared. Requests for digital access logs were filed. The employee I suspected, Aaron, was placed under discreet review. No confrontation, no warning. Pressure was the point. 2 days later, he cracked. He asked for a meeting. His email was short, polite, urgent. When he sat across from me, he couldn't meet my eyes. He spoke quickly, explaining that he had felt trapped, that he had been approached by someone connected to Lila's circle months earlier. He said they framed it as harmless, just context, just reassurance. He said he never thought it would turn into this. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked one question. "Did they pay you?" He hesitated, then nodded. The confession felt strangely anticlimactic. I didn't feel anger. I felt relief. Proof has a way of calming chaos. I documented everything, recorded statements, transfer records, timelines. Then I turned it over to my attorney. Within hours, the strategy shifted again. At the next court appearance, my attorney presented the evidence of internal collusion. Not dramatically, methodically. The judge listened, his expression growing darker with every detail. Lila's attorney tried to deflect, arguing that Aaron had acted independently, that any information shared was misunderstood or misused. But the judge wasn't interested in excuses. "Intent matters," he said. "And so does impact." He ordered further investigation. He warned all parties against interference. And then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "If it is determined that this bankruptcy filing was initiated or sustained through knowingly falsified representations," he said, "there will be consequences." Consequences. The word landed differently this time. Outside the courthouse, the cameras were relentless. Headlines shifted. The tone changed. What had once been framed as a failed CEO under family scrutiny was now being questioned as something far more complex. My parents stopped calling. Lila stopped smiling. That evening I sat alone again, but the solitude felt different now. Less like abandonment, more like space. For years I had been taught to measure my worth through their approval, through silence, through endurance. Now, I was watching the structures that had controlled me begin to crumble under the weight of their own actions. I didn't feel victorious, not yet, but I felt steady. The truth was no longer hidden. It was unfolding, piece by piece, in a place where family names didn't outweigh evidence. And as I prepared for what came next, one thought stayed with me, clear and unwavering. They had tried to bankrupt me to erase my independence. Instead, they had forced me into the one position they never wanted me to occupy, the one where I had nothing left to lose, and everything left to prove. The night before the final hearing, I didn't sleep at all. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to slow down. It kept replaying the same question over and over. Not about the court, not about the outcome, but about my parents. About how far they were willing to go, and how much they were prepared to lose, just to avoid admitting they were wrong. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but it sharpened rather than dulled me. I moved through the routine with mechanical calm. Shower, coffee, suit. Each step felt deliberate, as if I were assembling armor piece by piece. When I arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was different. The crowd was larger, the press presence heavier. This wasn't just another hearing anymore. Something had shifted in public perception, and everyone could feel it. Inside courtroom 7, the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. I took my seat beside my attorney, my posture straight, my hands steady. Across the aisle, Lila sat rigidly, her composure strained. My parents were behind her, side by side, their faces tight with rehearsed solemnity. They looked like people bracing for impact. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet. From the first moment, his tone was unmistakable. This was no longer a procedural review. This was an examination. My attorney began by summarizing the new evidence. Not emotionally, not defensively, just facts, layered one on top of the other until the pattern became impossible to deny. Internal access logs, financial transfers, Aaron's signed statement, the amended filings that mirrored internal language too closely to be coincidence. As she spoke, I watched my parents' faces. My mother stared straight ahead, lips pressed together, her hands clenched in her lap. My father's jaw tightened with every sentence. Lila stared at the table, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. Then it was their turn. Lila's attorney stood, clearing his throat, and attempted to reframe the situation. He spoke about misunderstandings, about overzealous employees, about coincidence. He argued that family disputes often created emotional distortions, and that this was, at its core, a civil disagreement blown out of proportion. The judge listened patiently. Then he leaned forward. "Counsel," he said, "do you dispute that Ms. Moore's legal team submitted documents containing proprietary internal language that was not publicly available at the time?" The attorney hesitated. "We acknowledge similarities," he said carefully, "but similarity does not equal misconduct." The judge nodded. "Perhaps not," he said, "but patterns do." He turned his attention to Lila. "Ms. Moore," he said, "I am going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer." Lila looked up, startled. Did you, at any point, receive non-public financial projections, contingency plans, or internal communications relating to your sister's company? The room went silent. I felt my heartbeat slow. This was the moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, just unavoidable. Lila's lips parted. She glanced briefly at her attorney, then at my parents. "I relied on information provided by others," she said. "That is not what I asked," the judge replied evenly. "Did you receive it?" A pause stretched out, taut and exposed. "Yes," she said quietly, "but I didn't solicit it. It was offered." My mother inhaled sharply. My father closed his eyes. The admission hit the room like a physical wave. The judge nodded once. "Thank you," he said. "That will be noted." He turned to the clerk and made a brief notation, then addressed the court again. "This changes the posture of this case," he said. "What was presented as a family-driven creditor action now bears the hallmarks of coordinated interference." He looked directly at my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Moore," he said, "you have been present throughout these proceedings. You have publicly supported this action. Were you aware that your younger daughter was in possession of internal corporate data not legally available to her?" My mother shook her head rapidly. "No," she said. "We didn't know." My father hesitated longer. "We knew she had advisors," he said carefully. "We trusted the process." The judge's gaze hardened. "Trust does not absolve responsibility," he said, "especially when reputational and financial harm is foreseeable." He leaned back, folding his hands. "At this point," he continued, "the court must consider whether this action was pursued in bad faith." Bad faith. The words landed with quiet finality. Lila's attorney objected, arguing that intent had not been proven, that motivations were complex in family matters. The judge overruled him. "I have heard enough," he said. The ruling came swiftly after that. The bankruptcy claim was dismissed, not conditionally, not pending further review. Dismissed. The judge stated clearly that the evidence supported a finding of abuse of process and misrepresentation. He ordered the immediate lifting of all account freezes tied to the claim. He warned that further attempts to pursue similar actions without new evidence would result in sanctions. As he spoke, I felt something inside me loosen for the first time in months. Not triumph, release. Then he said something that silenced the room entirely. "The court will also be referring this matter for review regarding potential civil liability," he said, "including claims of tortious interference and breach of fiduciary duty." My parents froze. Lila's head snapped up. The judge's gavel came down once, sharp and decisive. "Court is adjourned." For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted into motion. Reporters surged forward. Attorneys gathered documents. Voices overlapped in a low roar of conversation. I stayed seated, breathing slowly, grounding myself in the reality of what had just happened. My attorney touched my arm. "It's over," she said quietly. I stood, gathering my things, and turned to leave. That was when my mother reached me. "Elena," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, wait." I stopped. She stepped closer, tears in her eyes, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "We never wanted this," she said. "We were just trying to keep the family together." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt an unexpected wave of sadness. Not for myself, but for the truth she couldn't face. "You tried to keep the image together," I said. "At my expense." My father joined her, his face pale. "We thought you could handle it," he said. "You've always been strong." There it was, the final justification, strength mistaken for consent. "I was strong," I said. "That doesn't mean I was meant to be sacrificed." Lila stood a few feet away, silent now, her eyes darting between us. For the first time she looked uncertain, smaller, like someone realizing the game was over and the scoreboard wasn't in her favor. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't need to. I walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the flash of cameras was blinding. Questions were shouted, microphones pushed forward. I didn't stop. I didn't answer. I let my attorney guide me through the crowd and into the daylight beyond. The air outside felt sharp and clean. Real. As we reached the steps, I paused, taking it in. The noise, the movement, the sense of something irrevocably ended. I had walked into that building labeled a failure, a liability, a problem to be managed. I walked out with my company intact, my name cleared, and the truth finally visible. But the victory felt quieter than I expected, because as the adrenaline faded, one reality settled heavily in my chest. I had won the case, but I had lost my family long before the judge ever took the bench. And strangely, that loss no longer terrified me. It clarified everything. As I descended the steps and disappeared into the city, one thought anchored itself firmly in my mind. The worst thing they ever did wasn't trying to bankrupt me. It was teaching me that survival would require letting them go. And now that I had, there was nothing left to stop me from moving forward. Not in fear, but in truth. The first morning after the ruling felt unnaturally quiet. No frantic calls, no legal alerts, no notifications demanding my attention before I had even opened my eyes. The silence was disorienting, like stepping onto solid ground after months at sea and still feeling the sway beneath your feet. I went into the office early, before anyone else arrived. The building smelled faintly of cleaning solution and stale coffee, a familiar scent that grounded me. I stood in the lobby for a long moment, looking at the company logo on the wall. For weeks, I had walked past it with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on my chest, wondering if this place would still belong to me by the end of the month. Now it did. Not because someone had spared me, but because I had fought for it. By mid-morning, the team began to arrive. There was an awkwardness in the air, the kind that comes after a crisis when people don't know which version of reality they're allowed to acknowledge. Some smiled cautiously. Others avoided my eyes, unsure whether celebration or restraint was appropriate. I gathered everyone in the main conference room. No speeches, no dramatics. I thanked them for holding the line, for continuing to do their jobs under pressure most people would never understand. I told them the accounts were unfrozen, the contracts reinstated, and the immediate threat resolved. I didn't mention my family. I didn't need to. Relief rippled through the room, quiet but palpable. Shoulders loosened, breaths released. A few people clapped softly, then stopped unsure. I let it pass without comment. We didn't need applause, we needed stability. Later that day, the emails began. Partners who had gone silent during the lawsuit reached out, cautiously optimistic. Some apologized, others framed their absence as prudence. I accepted what was useful and ignored the rest. Reputation is a strange currency. It disappears quickly and returns slowly, and only if you stop chasing it. The board requested a formal review, not adversarial, procedural. They wanted assurance that the company was protected against similar attacks in the future. I welcomed it. Transparency was no longer a threat to me. It was armor. That afternoon, my attorney called with an update. The referral the judge mentioned was moving forward, not just against Lila, but against the individuals involved in facilitating the internal leak. There would be depositions, investigations, consequences. I listened without reaction. Justice, I had learned, is rarely loud. It unfolds in measured steps, indifferent to how long you waited for it. When I hung up, I sat back in my chair and stared out the window. For the first time since this began, I wasn't bracing for the next hit. I was simply present. That night, I went home and cooked dinner. A real meal. Not something rushed or eaten standing up. I turned off my phone and let the apartment fill with quiet. I realized how long it had been since I allowed myself something as simple as rest without guilt. 2 days later, my parents came to the office. They didn't call ahead. The receptionist buzzed me, her voice hesitant, asking if I was expecting visitors. I knew immediately who it was. I told her to send them up. They stood in the doorway of my office like strangers, unsure of the customs in a foreign country. My mother's eyes were red. My father looked thinner somehow, his confidence stripped down to something brittle. I didn't offer them seats. My mother spoke first. She said she hadn't slept since the hearing. She said she didn't recognize how things had spiraled so far. She said families weren't supposed to end up in courtrooms. I listened. My father said he wanted to make things right. He said mistakes had been made on all sides. He said we should find a way to move forward without more damage. I asked him one question. "Are you here because you're sorry," I said, "or because you're afraid of what happens next?" He didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. My mother reached for my hand. I stepped back. I told them I wasn't interested in apologies that only arrived once accountability became unavoidable. I told them I wasn't seeking revenge, but I was done pretending that love required me to be expendable. They asked what I wanted. "I want boundaries," I said, "and distance." My mother cried. My father nodded stiffly, as if acknowledging a business decision rather than a personal one. When they left, I closed the door and felt a surprising sense of calm. Not relief, acceptance. Some doors don't slam, they simply stop opening. The fallout reached Lila soon after. She tried to call, then text, then sent an email framed as reflection. She said she had acted out of fear. She said she felt overshadowed. She said she never meant for it to go this far. I didn't respond, not because I hated her, but because I finally understood her. And understanding didn't require reconciliation. The company moved forward. We renegotiated contracts, rebuilt trust, implemented stricter internal controls. I promoted people who had proven their integrity under pressure and let go of those who hadn't. Quietly, professionally, without spectacle. One evening, weeks later, I attended an industry event I had skipped during the lawsuit. People approached me cautiously at first, then with genuine interest. Some congratulated me, others asked how I handled it. I told them the truth. I stopped waiting for permission to defend myself. The press eventually lost interest. Scandals have a short shelf life when they don't end in spectacle. My story became a footnote, a cautionary tale, a quiet example of resilience rather than collapse. And that was enough. Late one night, I received a message from a junior employee who had joined during the chaos. She thanked me for staying. She said watching me stand my ground made her feel safer building her own career. I sat with that for a long time. Leadership, I realized, isn't about never falling. It's about what you model when the fall is public. As the months passed, the scars faded into something like memory. Not erased, integrated. I stopped flinching at unexpected calls, stopped scanning rooms for threats. Life didn't return to what it was before. It became something better, quieter, cleaner, honest. I didn't rebuild bridges with my family. I built something else instead. A life that didn't require their approval to feel whole. On a crisp autumn morning, I walked into the office and paused again beneath the logo. This time, I smiled. They had tried to bankrupt me to teach me humility. What they taught me instead was sovereignty. And that was something no court, no family name, no manufactured narrative could ever take away. The invitation arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, slipped under my apartment door sometime between dusk and dawn. I noticed it only because it felt heavier than it should have when I picked it up, as if the paper itself carried intention. Inside was a single card with careful handwriting, a request, not a demand. My sister wanted to meet. One last conversation. No lawyers, no parents, just us. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time holding that card between my fingers. The old version of me would have gone immediately, driven by hope or guilt or the habit of cleaning up messes I didn't make. But that woman didn't exist anymore. I had learned, painfully, that closure offered by people who caused the wound often came with conditions. Still, curiosity won. We met in a small park near the river, the kind of place families used on weekends and office workers passed through without noticing. It was early evening, the light soft, the air cool enough to carry the smell of leaves and water. Lila was already there, sitting on a bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked smaller than I remembered, not fragile but stripped of performance. She stood when she saw me, hesitated, then sat back down. "Thank you for coming," she said. I nodded but didn't sit. I wanted to leave myself the option of walking away without ceremony. She started talking immediately, as if afraid silence would swallow her courage. She said the investigation was ongoing. She said the pressure was unbearable. She said she hadn't slept in weeks. Her voice shook when she mentioned our parents, how devastated they were, how ashamed. I listened without interruption. Then she said the sentence I had expected, the one that had always followed any conflict between us. "I never meant to hurt you." The words landed flat, familiar, overused. I asked her one question. "When you filed that case, what did you think would happen to me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked out at the river, watching the water move past as if the answer might float by. "I thought you'd step down," she said finally. "I thought you'd realize it was too much. I thought I'd save you from yourself." I let out a slow breath. "You thought destroying my career would save me?" She winced. "I didn't think it would go that far." "But you knew it could," I said. She didn't deny it. That was the moment I understood something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. Lila didn't see me as a person who could be wronged. She saw me as an obstacle in her own story, one she believed she was entitled to move. She talked about growing up in my shadow, about how our parents praised my independence while criticizing her sensitivity, about how every success of mine felt like an indictment of her choices, about how, when she saw my company thriving, something inside her snapped. "I just wanted them to see me," she said quietly. "They always did," I replied. "They just never asked you to be me." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something raw flicker across her face. Not remorse, recognition. She asked if there was any way to fix it. I told her the truth. "You can't fix what you refuse to see as wrong." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the sound of the river filling the space between us. Finally, she stood. "I hope one day you can forgive me," she said. I met her gaze. Forgiveness isn't the same as access. She seemed to understand. When I walked away, I didn't feel triumphant or relieved. I felt resolved. Some chapters don't end with reconciliation. They end with clarity. The aftermath unfolded quietly after that. The investigation concluded months later. Findings were issued. Consequences followed. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that made headlines, but real enough to change lives. Lila withdrew from public view. My parents retreated into a smaller world, one where appearances mattered less because there were fewer people left to impress. We didn't speak again. Instead, my life began to take on a new shape. The company expanded carefully, deliberately. I stopped chasing rapid growth and focused on sustainability. I built teams instead of hierarchies. I invested in people who valued transparency over proximity to power. Outside of work, I rebuilt myself slowly. I learned what it felt like to make decisions without hearing my parents' voices in my head. I learned that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the absence of self-betrayal. I made new traditions, new friendships, new definitions of family. One evening, I was invited to speak at a small leadership forum. No cameras, no press, just a room of people navigating their own complicated lives. I told them parts of my story, not the legal details, but the emotional truth. How betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. How survival sometimes means walking away from those who taught you to stay. Afterward, a woman approached me. She said she was considering cutting ties with her own family after years of manipulation. She asked how I knew it was time. I told her, "When staying costs you more than leaving." That answer stayed with me long after the room emptied. The final moment of reckoning came unexpectedly. A letter arrived from my mother. Handwritten. Apologetic. She didn't excuse herself. She didn't explain. She simply said she was sorry for not protecting me when it mattered. She said she was learning. Too late, perhaps, but sincerely. I read it twice. Then I placed it in a drawer. Not out of spite, out of discernment. Some apologies heal, others acknowledge. This one did both, but it didn't change the boundary I had set. Growth doesn't require reopening every door. As winter turned to spring, I noticed something remarkable. I was no longer angry, not numb, not detached, just free. The story that once defined me no longer owned me. It had become something I carried lightly, a reminder of what I had survived, and what I had chosen not to repeat. Late one night, I stood by my window watching the city lights, thinking about the girl I had been 8 years ago. The one who believed love meant endurance. The one who stayed quiet to keep the peace. The one who thought family loyalty was unconditional. I wished I could tell her what I knew now. That dignity is not something you earn by suffering. That silence is not the same as strength. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the people who taught you to doubt yourself. I turned away from the window and went to bed, not with a sense of victory, but with something far more enduring. Closure. Not because they gave it to me, but because I finally gave it to myself. The morning I realized the story no longer hurt was unremarkable. No sunrise revelation, no sudden rush of forgiveness. I was standing in line at a small coffee shop near the office, listening to the hiss of the espresso machine, watching people check their phones and shuffle forward, when it occurred to me that my chest felt light, not empty, light. The kind of lightness that comes when you stop bracing for impact. For years I had lived as if something terrible was always about to happen, as if love could be revoked at any moment, as if security depended on how quiet I stayed, how useful I made myself, how little trouble I caused. Even after the court ruling, even after the evidence surfaced and the truth became undeniable, that reflex lingered. Trauma has a long memory. But that morning, standing there with a paper cup warming my hands, I understood something simple and profound. I was no longer waiting for anyone to forgive me. I had forgiven myself. The company continued to grow, but not in the way people expected. I turned down opportunities that felt rushed or ego-driven. I chose projects that aligned with my values, partnerships built on mutual respect instead of leverage. Success stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like stewardship. People often asked how I managed to rebuild trust after everything that happened. I told them the truth. I didn't rebuild trust with everyone. I learned to discern where it belonged. There is a difference between openness and accessibility. I learned to protect my time, my energy, my inner life. I learned that boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions for how to love me without harm. My parents remained distant, cordial at times, polite messages on holidays, occasional updates passed through mutual acquaintances. We existed in parallel now, no longer colliding, no longer pretending. It was strange and sometimes sad, but it was honest. Lila disappeared from my life completely. I heard fragments through the grapevine, new ventures that never quite took off, circles that slowly closed. Consequences have a way of arriving quietly when spectacle fades. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't need to. My life was no longer organized around proving anything to them. One afternoon, months later, I sat with my leadership team reviewing a proposal when one of the younger managers hesitated before speaking. She asked a question about ethical risk, about what we would do if pressure came from someone powerful, someone connected. The room went still. I smiled gently and answered without hesitation. I told her we would walk away, that no contract, no investment, no relationship was worth losing ourselves. She looked relieved. Others nodded. In that moment, I realized the story had traveled farther than I thought, not as gossip, as precedent. The most meaningful legacy isn't what you build, it's what you refuse to sacrifice while building it. On the anniversary of the court ruling, I didn't mark the day. No reminders, no reflection posts. I spent it hiking with friends, laughing, breathing cold air into my lungs. I let my phone stay buried in my bag, untouched. That night, as we sat around a fire, someone asked me if I would ever write about what happened. Share it publicly. Turn it into something consumable. I considered it. Then I said, only if it helps someone else stop blaming themselves. Because that was the cruelest part of it all. Not the lawsuit, not the public scrutiny, not even the betrayal. It was the years I spent wondering if I deserved it. I didn't. And neither do you, if any part of this story feels uncomfortably familiar. If you have ever been made to feel like your strength was a burden. If you have been told to be quiet for the sake of peace. If the people who were supposed to protect you became the ones who used your loyalty against you. You are not weak for wanting love. You are not wrong for refusing harm. And you are not obligated to stay where your dignity is treated as collateral. I wish someone had told me that earlier. I wish someone had said that walking away doesn't mean you failed at family. Sometimes it means you succeeded at survival. These days, my life feels smaller in the best way. Fewer voices, clearer priorities. A steadiness I once thought was reserved for other people. I wake up without dread. I work without fear. I rest without guilt. And when I look in the mirror, I recognize the woman staring back at me. Not because she is unscarred, but because she is whole. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Truly. Stories like this don't end with neat bows or perfect justice. They end with choice, with clarity, with the quiet courage to build a life that doesn't require you to disappear. If something in this resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself? Share your experience in the comments. You never know who might read it and feel less alone. And if you found value in this story, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most, the ones sitting in silence, wondering if they're allowed to choose themselves. Stay with us. More stories are coming. Stories about justice, about dignity, about the quiet power of walking away and building something better. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.